by reimposing aluminum tariffs on Canada. Canada was taking advantage of us, as usual.
6 of Canada's 13 steel plants are in Ontario, and as steel is to Ontario, aluminum is to Quebec, with 60% used in the U.S. coming from Quebec. So you can bet tariffs, no matter the size, will hurt small businesses who are largely dependent on that big American market.
And again, we love the Americans. It's unfortunate President Trump decided to go down this road.
Hey, welcome back to my channel. Today's story begins with a line so blunt it sounded less like diplomacy and more like a secret finally being exposed. There is no deal. Those 4 words, spoken by the U.S. ambassador, didn't just close the door on negotiations. They pulled the floor out from under one of North America's closest trade ties. For Canada, the stakes couldn't be higher. Nearly 3/4 of its exports still rely on the American market, and yet the certainty of access that once felt unshakable now hangs by a thread. What happens when the neighbor you depend on decides the rules no longer apply? The United States faces a different shock. By imposing tariffs on steel, lumber, and aluminum, Washington may have created a problem it cannot control. Inflation risks climbing higher, construction costs may surge, and consumers could soon find themselves paying more for goods that were once routine. So here's the question. If the privileged partnership between Washington and Ottawa is cracking, how far could this rift spread? And what does it mean for the future of North America's economy? Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. And the ripple effects didn't take long to show. What was framed in Washington as a protective shield for American industry is already starting to look like a heavy burden for the very people it was meant to protect. Take construction, for example. A 25% tariff on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber doesn't just target foreign producers. It drives up the cost of every home built in the United States. Builders associations have warned that the added expense could mean thousands of extra dollars per unit, putting the dream of home ownership even further out of reach for many families. The pain doesn't stop there. With tensions spreading to other sectors, the U.S. tourism industry has begun to feel the chill. International visitors are increasingly wary of a country seen as unpredictable in its trade policies, leaving airlines, hotels, and local economies exposed to sudden drops in revenue. And for everyday consumers, the story is even simpler. Groceries, appliances, cars, and countless other goods now carry an invisible surcharge. From metals to farm products, higher prices are no longer an abstract talking point. They're showing up in shopping carts across America. If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. But while American consumers began to feel the pressure at home, north of the border the response was anything but silent. Ottawa chose not to bend under the weight of new tariffs. Instead, it turned resistance into both a political and economic message. Former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau put it bluntly, calling Washington's measures a very stupid thing to do. That choice of words captured the frustration of a country unwilling to be treated as a junior partner. Canada's strategy was not to escalate recklessly, but to demonstrate that it could and would defend its interests. The government quickly imposed a matching 25% tariff on U.S. goods valued at an estimated 30 billion Canadian dollars, a move designed to mirror Washington's pressure while signaling that Canada would not be cornered. At the same time, Ottawa filed a formal case at the World Trade Organization in March 2025, describing the U.S. duties as unjustified and inconsistent with international trade rules. Taken together, these actions conveyed a clear message. Canada would not accept being forced into concessions, particularly with a critical renegotiation of the USMCA looming on the horizon. For Ottawa, standing firm now was not just about today's dispute, it was about shaping the balance of power for the talks to come. This standoff quickly began to reshape the numbers that usually define the balance of power in North American trade. For decades, the United States absorbed the majority of Canadian exports, anchoring Ottawa's economic fortunes to decisions made in Washington. But the latest figures suggest that foundation is starting to shift. In May, Canada's exports to the U.S. fell by an estimated 15%, a drop worth roughly 7.7 billion Canadian dollars. Under normal circumstances, such a decline would trigger alarm in Ottawa. Yet the losses were partly offset by gains elsewhere. Shipments to the rest of the world rose by more than 40% over the same period, evidence that Canada was finding ways to redirect its goods to alternative markets. The result is a slow but steady rebalancing. Within a single year, the share of Canadian exports bound for the U.S. slipped from about 3/4 to just over 2/3. Each percentage point lost may seem small, but together they mark a broader trend. The United States is no longer the uncontested center of gravity for Canadian trade. And with every fraction of market share Canada manages to replace abroad, Washington's leverage over its northern neighbor weakens. A subtle but unmistakable erosion of influence that could prove difficult to reverse. Faced with the risk of overdependence on a single partner, Ottawa began treating the trade rift not only as a challenge, but also as an opening. If access to the American market could no longer be taken for granted, then the logical response was to build new pillars of resilience elsewhere. One of the first moves came in the form of a $5 billion support package aimed at helping Canadian companies expand beyond the U.S. market. The goal was clear: provide the financial and logistical backing for exporters to establish footholds in regions less vulnerable to Washington's policy swings. The results were striking in some sectors. Gold exports to the United Kingdom, for example, surged to record levels, rising more than fourfold and vaulting London into the position of Canada's second-largest trade partner, ahead of China. Meanwhile, negotiations with Mexico deepened, producing fresh agreements that extended the framework of North American cooperation. Energy, too, became a cornerstone of this diversification. The long-delayed liquefied natural gas projects on Canada's west coast were pushed forward with renewed urgency, their backers arguing that Asian markets could absorb volumes once destined for the United States. And on the infrastructure side, Canadian ports received expanded investment, positioning the country as a hub designed to connect Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic routes in a way that diminished U.S. choke points. What emerged was not just a defensive adjustment, but the outline of a broader strategy: turn a moment of vulnerability into a blueprint for global connectivity, even if the transition would be neither quick nor painless. Still, diversification abroad did not shield Canadians entirely from the turbulence. Everyday households felt the squeeze in subtle but noticeable ways. Certain imports from the U.S., such as coffee and select consumer goods, climbed sharply in price. Yet here, too, Canada leaned on alternatives. European suppliers stepped in to fill gaps, preventing shortages even if costs remained higher than before. What made the picture more complex was the labor market. Instead of unraveling, Canada posted a modest improvement. Unemployment slipped to around 6.9% in June, with an estimated 83,000 new jobs added, the strongest gain in half a year. Analysts pointed out that many of these positions were linked to infrastructure projects, port expansions, and trade realignment efforts, suggesting that policy adjustments were cushioning the blow. Monetary policy also played its part. The Bank of Canada lowered interest rates, easing the burden on households struggling with mortgages and credit. While not a cure-all, the move signaled that Ottawa was determined to soften the pressure before it could spiral into the kind of inflationary cycle seen in the United States. The result was a mixed reality. Canadians felt the discomfort of rising costs in certain areas, but they did not face the overwhelming erosion of income that inflation was inflicting south of the border. It was less a story of immunity than of resilience, a society absorbing the shock without breaking under it. Yet even as Ottawa managed the short-term turbulence, its eyes were fixed firmly on the bigger contest ahead. The looming renegotiation of the USMCA in 2026 meant that every decision taken now would shape Canada's bargaining position later. Concessions under pressure could weaken its hand. Resistance, by contrast, might strengthen it. Prime Minister Mark Carney framed the approach not in terms of confrontation, but in terms of preparation. His government announced a push to deepen domestic integration, with the goal of eliminating internal trade barriers by July 1st. Economists suggested that such a move could reduce costs by as much as 15% across industries, while potentially lifting GDP growth in the range of 4 to 8%. The idea was simple but strategic. If Canada could rely more on seamless trade within its own borders, it would be less vulnerable to external shocks. This diversification abroad and integration at home created a buffer that made Ottawa less likely to fold under U.S. pressure when the negotiating table reopened. In that sense, the tariffs were not only a crisis, but also a catalyst. They accelerated reforms that Canada had long debated but never fully implemented, giving Ottawa a chance to enter the 2026 talks with both stronger defenses and a clearer vision of independence. By this stage, it was clear the dispute had grown beyond a bilateral quarrel. The clash between Washington and Ottawa now looked more like a stress test for the future of global trade. On one side, the United States leaned harder into protectionism, locking itself into a cycle of rising costs and declining trust from international partners. On the other, Canada, though undeniably exposed, began to see the outlines of a broader opportunity, the chance to rebuild its trade foundations on a more diverse and sustainable footing. The contrast is striking. America's strategy risks isolating it at a moment when supply chains are already fragile and inflation is politically toxic. Canada, meanwhile, frames its setbacks as a pivot point, not an end, but a transition. The question that lingers is not whether both countries will pay a price, but whether the divergence could ultimately produce two distinct economic paths within North America itself. If the United States continues down this road, will Canada finally escape its neighbor's shadow? And more importantly, could the world be watching the first signs of a continent divided into two competing models of trade? Thanks for sticking around. If you found this valuable, like and subscribe to support more content like this. And now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Is Canada truly carving out a stronger, independent role in global trade? Or is this just a temporary detour until the next round of negotiations brings both sides back together? Share your perspective in the comments. The debate is just beginning.